have been exploring stories of healing in the Gospel of Matthew and one in the Gospel of John. It's been 54 weeks. Can you believe it? 54 weeks since we last gathered in our sanctuary here in this space. 54 Sundays and even more worship services experienced through our phones and tablets and computer screens. We've been in Lent for 5 weeks, but in some ways, Lent 2020 never ended, and it can feel a little bit like we're right back where we began, still stuck in this boat, weathering this storm together. Heck, weathering the many storms that, like in our gospel reading, have converged in this past year like a violent whirlwind threatening to swamp our collective boat. At times, I've found myself wondering whether I or whether we will truly rise to the moment that we are in, wondering what kind of future we will be leaving future generations by how we choose to respond to these storms, whether there will be a future for them. For as Martin Luther King put it, we must learn to live together as kin, or we will perish together as fools. Like it or not, we are all in this boat, stuck here together. Like the disciples, we may be wondering why Jesus doesn't seem to be satisfied with them yet, with us yet. Why does he keep asking for more? After all, they were the ones who kept showing up, who'd given of their time and lives, who'd made financial contributions and even sacrifices. When others had left, the disciples had stuck it out. They'd been good, faithful folks. So why the harsh response when Jesus' disciple wants to bury his father, to spend time mourning with his family? Well, certainly in the greater context of the Gospels, it's clear that Jesus isn't opposed to such things in and of themselves. But Jesus and the disciples in ordinary times and extraordinary circumstances call for extraordinary responses. See, in such historical moments, God calls us to something bigger than ourselves and our individual realities, and for which we must be willing to make sacrifices. And this is one of those moments. Once again, Jesus' ministry, and thus the ministry of all those who would follow after him, it isn't tied to family or place or to a building or to a specific community. Rather, it is committed to crossing over, as he does in this text, crossing over any and all such boundaries that would segregate us, barriers between us and them, which our gospel reading represents by these chaotic and turbulent forces of the sea. Jesus calls us from the shores of our comfort into these seas to cross over to the other side. And this is the journey that is necessary, not only for the healing of others, but also for ourselves. Indeed, for all creation, for this is a journey that changes everyone and everything. Indeed, more than the literal level of the gospel story of weathering a literal storm, this morning's story, like the healing stories that we've been exploring thus far in Lent, is about facing those forces that seek to silence and disempower, those forces that seek to overcome life and flourishing, the glory of creation by wreaking havoc and suffering and inequity and injustice, what Scripture calls the forces of death. Jesus calls us to be a seafaring people, a boundary-crossing people, knowing that to do so, to be willing to get onto those waters, is to inevitably face great storms. But he's been preparing us, his disciples, for this moment like students, like apprentices. He's been loving us, teaching and correcting us, comforting and encouraging us. Jesus has been showing us the way. We've been able to follow safely behind him and let him take care of it. But now Jesus is taking us with the disciples from the shallow waters along the shoreline out into those deep waters, entrusting us with the power to take what we've learned and rise to the moment when that storm inevitably comes. Because come it will, come it does, for those disciples and for us. And oftentimes, in our understandable humanness, we respond much like the disciples, don't we? With paralyzing fear and simply screaming for God to fix it, just make it go away. But as we invited you to reflect on earlier, fear and anxiety amidst life's storms, they are both natural and understandable. They're not bad in and of themselves. And in fact, we evolved to experience fear in order to alert us to danger, to let us know that, hey, something needs to change. The question is, how will we respond not only to the storm itself, but to our fear in the face of it? Different circumstances require different responses, to be sure. Sometimes you need to flee. Sometimes you need to stay there and fight. Sometimes you need to freeze, to pause and collect yourself. Sometimes these evolutionary responses are understandable, but sometimes they prove to be inadequate to the situation in which we find ourselves. Here's the thing, we need to evolve further if we are to have a shared future where there can be flourishing for all. That's something we haven't quite accomplished here in human history yet. But to evolve further requires some very real changes to how we operate, and how we respond to our environment, to the storms when they arise. As the old adage goes, insanity is doing the same thing over and over, I know you know this, and expecting different results. For a nation that prides itself on the mind-blowing technological advancements that have taken us to the depths of the earth and to the outer reaches of the universe, for all of that, we remain profoundly primitive when it comes to our deep-seated reactions and responses to our environment, to those backgrounds, to those whose backgrounds and experiences, those whose religion and realities are different from our own. We simply continue to operate as humans have for millennia without realizing that we will ultimately use our technological advancements, our innovations, to destroy ourselves if our monkey brains and hearts don't themselves evolve. If they are what continue to control us and turn the gears of our society and our government. Evolving, growing, changing is hard work. It's constant work. Like the disciples, we are often resistant to both this heart work and the rewiring of our brains. But this is the journey that our faith calls us to, and indeed that our faith gives us the resources for. Unfortunately, religion and churches and preachers, probably blame it mostly on the preachers, but we'll all take some blame. We've far too often used religion to justify our primitive nature, rather than to help us evolve beyond it. And this morning, I think it's important to note how this is especially the case when it comes to healing and caring for creation, for this glorious natural world that God has given us, for plants and wildlife, for birds and bees and land and air and sea. Too often we've ignored or justified exploiting the earth and its resources for short-term, short-sighted economic gain. Because we've believed that we, as humans, we are the pinnacle of creation and, well, therefore everything sort of exists to serve us, right? To feed us, to meet our needs. And too often, again, religion has been used to justify this egotistical, this prideful thinking. But as our scripture this morning, the psalmist poetically reminds us, the earth is not ours, the earth is the Lord's, and all that is within it. On its own accord, God provides everything that is needed for the flourishing of creation. We have been entrusted as stewards, as caretakers, to maintain and cultivate this glorious creation and its flourishing. But in our human-centric pride, we have brought about the sixth mass extinction, what scientists call the sixth mass extinction of wildlife and biodiversity in the history of this planet. And here's the thing, if creation suffers, we suffer, because there is no plan or planet B. This is our boat, and we are all in it together. It's great that they've put a rover on Mars, but that's not going to save us. We are all in this boat together. And so how will we choose to respond as the storms rage around us? As in the words of the Apostle Paul, as creation groans out in labor pains for healing and new life. Will we respond like the disciples who cower in fear, despairing that all hope is lost and that there is no future, let's just give up? Which there certainly won't be a future. If this is where we stay, the storm will sink us. Will we fail to act by simply praying for God to magically wave a wand and fix things? Will we simply keep reacting in the same ways that we have throughout history, the ways that have brought us to this point, but somehow expect different results? Friends, this is the mentality that Jesus kindly but firmly rebukes in his disciples as little faith, as having no power to heal or to calm storms or to bring peace. Rather, anchored in and empowered by God, we are called to face our fears with a courageous faith that rises to the moment as Jesus does, and that speaks a bold word of life into those chaotic, turbulent forces of death. For as the great North African theologian Augustine once wrote, God without us will not. And we, without God, we cannot. For some reason, God seems to be holding out hope, committed to this idea that we will evolve our hearts and minds beyond what we've been to become what is necessary for the healing and flourishing of all creation. Because that's the thing. Elsewhere in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus uses this phrase, ye of little faith, when the disciples are called to perform those same functions that Jesus has, to do the same kind of seemingly impossible things that Jesus has done, but they fail to do so because they are too afraid. Perhaps we can relate again. Our own times when we failed to rise to the occasion, to what's necessary, because we were too afraid of rocking the boat, too afraid of what others will think of us, too afraid of losing membership or of how it will affect our bottom line or our retirement or our business or our family or our reputation or our aspirations. I'm sure each of us could add our own to this long list. Faith is thus contrasted with fear, not because we pretend that we're not afraid. Again, that's inevitable, but faith is contrasted with fear because faith is the willingness to face our fears, to have the courage to act in ways that mirror the actions of Jesus, even when we are afraid. Which it turns out, if we follow Jesus onto the seas to cross over those barriers to the other side, well, it's inevitably going to happen. And indeed, there on the boat, the disciples marvel at Jesus' bold faith. What sort of human is this? They ask. Well, surely it is one who shows us the way to evolving beyond our primitive reactions and prejudices. Because it's not just for Jesus. Jesus models God's calling for all of us. And so, yes, in some ways we are right here back where we started, in Lent, feeling the weight of the world's brokenness, weary from weathering too many storms over the past year to count, wondering whether we're going to make it to the other side, wondering what it's even going to look like on the other side. But because of what we've been through together, we will never be the same. For God's sake and our own, may we never be the same. May the faith that we've uncovered this year as we've been forced together into this boat to weather these storms, the faith to boldly rise, to face them and speak into them like Jesus rather than cower in fear, the faith to take action empowered by God rather than simply asking God to fix things and letting ourselves off the hook. Letting ourselves continue to operate in the same mode that we have for decades, for generations. May this faith that we have uncovered in this year, this bold and courageous faith, continue to change us for our healing, and indeed for all the healing of all creation. May it be so.